Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this online conversation between author Alexandra Fuller and NPR's Lisa Mullins. I'm Lisa Mendez. I'm Director of Programs at the Miami Book Fair. We are planning our 37th Miami Book Fair to take place as usual this November. Please follow Miami Book Fair and Books on Books on social for regular updates. Before we bring Ms. Fuller and Ms. Mullins on screen, I want to remind you that you can purchase your copy of Travel Light, Move Fast through the link right under my head. Books on Books will mail it to you right away. Ms. Fuller and Ms. Mullins will be taking questions. Please write them in the Ask a Question box further down the screen. Travel Light, Move Fast is Alexandra Fuller's fourth memoir about her family, set once again against the backdrop of a brutal war and the wilderness of Southern Africa. As Ms. Fuller told NPR in an interview last year, Travel Light, Move Fast is about a man who moved with incredible swiftness, my dad, and shed everything he didn't need. But this book, as the Daily Beast reported, is also about how growing up in a world of white colonial racism affected Ms. Fuller and her family. Joining her this evening is Lisa Mullins, the voice of WBUR's All Things Considered. She anchors the program, conducts interviews, and reports from the field. Ms. Mullins is also guest anchor of the WBUR and NPR midday show Here and Now. A round of virtual applause, please, while I'll bring our guests up to the screen. Ms. Fuller, welcome.
Thank you.
And now I will bring Ms. Mullins right up. Here we are. Just another second or two. And we're live. I'm going to go away because you guys are so much more interesting than I am, but I'll be back screen with anything you need.
Thank you. So nice to see you again. So I'm in my yurt in Teutonia in rural Idaho. No. And the thing that I love about it is I live in it's a yurt, but I've built it on stilts. So I have the horse living beneath me and the dogs living with me. It's kind of the perfect, Well, I wrote 4 memoirs, so there's a lot to say. But it started off with, British parents born in the UK. My mother had been raised in Kenya, and they brought my sister and I to what was then Rhodesia. We spent really my formative years there during that country's civil war. I was educated there. When I was in my early 20s, I met and married an American, moved to the States, where I am now. And I would say sort of the tsunami of what landed me here began in middle age. And Jung says a middle age is something to break you and to reverse you. And I'm in the process of that reverse. The tide sort of came and smashed me up on the beach and sucked me out. And what that tide was really began in a way with the divorce of my husband from 20 years. And it wasn't just a divorce. We just split up amicably. He had this terrible horse accident right before we split up. And there was this real sense that the sort of quiet violence of this, I suppose, dishonest marriage, and that we had stopped being honest with each other about where we were, about how we were feeling about marriage, about what marriage is even. I mean, those conversations weren't being had. I think these massive crises of expectations. And then I feel like I spent the next 10 years sort of living out and acting out, sort of letting off steam of the sort of wash up of what can happen in middle age, not just a divorce, but then the death of my father. And then the estrangement one at a time from my remaining family members, my mother and my sister. And with that went Zambia and everything I'd grown up with, and the farm, and sort of so much of what I had sort of attached my identity to. And then my fiance and I of 6 years split up, and that was another tremendous sort of blow. And, you know, again, all of this stuff is things that you've attached your identity. And then most terribly, my son died 2 years ago in July. And so that, I mean, truly in the end, it's as if I spent the first 40 years of my life making a monument to who I was with all these memoirs. And then without needing to do a thing about it, middle age unburdened me of that identity and left me in a way, and I think profound grief does this. My friend Terry Tempest Williams, who's also a writer, talks about that there's certain griefs that you can't get over and you can't get through, but you learn to live with it. You go with that grief. But to do that means that you have to lose your own narrative, because going with a grief is, it's a mysterious instruction. It's invisible, and it requires you to have no luggage, or very little, or to keep just burdening yourself with that luggage as you go.
So, since your life has changed so much, even since this book first came out, congratulations on the paperback, by the way. I want to ask you a lot about it, starting with your dad's death, because that's where the book begins. But this, as you said,
Yes. I apologize for the interruption, but I am being told that we can't see Lisa and we can only see Miss Fuller. Hold on, please. I'm going to bring you, what I'm going to do, Lisa, is that I'm going to take you off stage. Okay. I can only see the same thing you can, so I am asking the audience.
The other suggestion is I repeat Lisa's questions, but I hate for you to miss Lisa's voice and Lisa's everything.
I think,
but I can do
I
that.
think they can hear me. They just can't see me.
Oh, okay.
Is that true?
That's what I'm trying to find out. Yeah, they say they cannot hear you. No.
Couldn't hear the question. Okay.
I am going to take you out and bring you back again, okay? So sorry. Okay, Lisa, I'm going to disconnect you, and then I'm going to bring you back on stage. I apologize, and if you'll give me a second, I'm going to try and make that happen.
I see myself now.
Yes, I see you and I hear you perfectly. Let me ask the audience.
I will talk a little bit more just right about this
That's
level.
great. Can you all see
Okay.
Lisa also? Great, fantastic. So I'm going to make myself scarce again. Thank you so much, everyone.
Well,
Thank you. Thanks for bearing with us,
everyone
everybody.
gets Lisa.
Yeah, no, thank you. And we're looking forward to getting your questions, by the way. And this is just such a pleasure to be here. And I'm glad that that of the two people you were missing the audio from, it was just me, because Alexandra is so fascinating. So so let me just ask you, yeah. So you were just saying that your life has changed a lot. And it's sort of starting fresh. So I want to ask you about your dad and about your mom. And I just wonder what it's like, before we do that, just to go back there, because it's such a rich history. Is it hard to go back?
Do you mean emotionally?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Very, 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 very difficult. And I think that until, again, this is going to be a really long answer, but in 2015, when my dad died, I stopped drinking the better to observe his grief. And that sobriety in and of itself has been so life-changing. I mean, a year in sobriety is more fascinating and changing, and it's like a year in childhood. You know, it's like you're learning. You drunk like I did for whatever it had been, ages, since I was 8 or something. You know, there's this, and I wouldn't say I wasn't a sort of noticeably raging alcoholic, but it certainly was sort of keeping a damper on things. Among them, you know, I had, I mean, I think it kept a damper on the trauma. I think it helped me dissociate and face emotionally difficult things without, you know, without the sting of empathy, that real pain, without the pity and shame that we read about in the Iliad. You know, when we hear about Achilles' anger, which is all the Iliad is about. And he's angry, 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 angry for 93% of this epic poem. And at last he feels pity and shame. And that makes him grieve, and he breaks. And I would say that, you know, a combination of sobriety, which is a form of grief, you go back and you sort of literally step by step face your life sober. And then there's a way in which grief is a sort of 12-step program. You know, there's all the denying. And then, I mean, once you've sort of come to acceptance that this is a thing I'm not going to have to do, that for me is almost the starting point of sobriety, emotional sobriety, alcohol sobriety, you know, an attempt to live a more sober, emotionally stable, enriched life, one that can hold everything and isn't so fragile that, you know, the vessel of me cracks every time I go in and face difficult stuff. But without alcohol, you know, it takes a lot more tools than I used to, just sort of plunging ahead, I think, through the pain. Mm-hmm. And now it really takes an insane amount of attention and meditation and, in a way, learning. I mean, relearning. For me, it's very helpful to go back to foundational texts like the myths, because, first of all, it's big picture. It takes all the little picture stuff out of it, and you can see yourself sort of in myth. And it helps, I think, I mean, it's a bit of a pain relief. I can see why people can stay there and be intellectually dishonest and swim around in myth or other people's story. But if you're going to write memoir, then you're going to have to go back into your own pain. And I think learning to process pain responsibly, learning that it's yours, learning that you're the only person who can get up, you're the only person who can stand up for yourself, you're the only person who can be with the grief. Again, it's a profound undressing. Everything that I comes back to, in a way, the title of this book and what my father learned, which was get rid of, just unburden. And it is a daily instruction. I mean, some days you wake up with more burden than others, and there doesn't seem to be a reason why. The tide shifts and somebody else's luggage lands in your boat, and it takes you a minute to realize it's not yours. Or old luggage washes up as a result of the weather changes and the storm brews up, and the luggage of missing that particular, my son. And a lot of that comes from not being an acceptance of the fact that, I said that I'd love him unconditionally, and that includes if he became my precocious ancestor. And that's an enormous shift, and it takes time to practice that shift. And I think that's what grief is. It's practice. It's a practice. Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I'm sorry. I do want to get back to that, but we should say that when you talk about drinking and sobriety, that there are a lot of stories about your childhood, and there's a lot of liquid going around there with your parents. And I don't want people who are not familiar with your writing to think that there is not humor laced through every page of what you write. And I literally laugh out loud. And I have to say that when I first read the book, which was about a year ago, I called my friends and said, you have to read this. And I wanted to read them passages, but I can never do it the same way you do. This time around, I listened to the audio book, which you read, which I think is fantastic that you do. And I laughed again out loud. And so I wonder, like, where do the two meet? Where do the ideas of grief and sobriety and pleasure and laughter and familiarity meet?
They never are not in each other's company. I think they're all right there. And I think that to grieve intensely is to find intense joy. To feel intensely is to feel intense joy. It's that wonderful quote of Rilke's that's at the beginning of the end of Jojo Rabbit, the film Jojo Rabbit, where he says something like, feel it all the horror, all the beauty. It's, I think that you can come in with a big life force and a big appetite for life, and that can be good or bad. Actually, neither of those words are correct. It just is. But with that life force and with that energy, I think that, you consume emotions a little differently. And I think if you're a writer too, it gives you a place to have this, have a big experience and then be forced to put it into narrative, put yourself in context. And so the humor part always comes in with the context, because trauma is a sudden event without context. Humor is the context. Humor is the part that says, and this is also absurd that this should happen.
So start off with where the book starts, and it is rather absurd. You and your parents are in Budapest, in Hungary, and I don't know if they so much seemed like fish out of water, but your father, who had been ill, died, and I wonder if you can tell us how that began, how you and your mom handled it, because it was completely unexpected, and there you are, having to deal with people in a different language, having to figure out how to get his body cremated and then back to your home in southern Africa. Laughter ensues, even though it doesn't seem like it should. But can you tell us about that experience?
Well, it wasn't my mother that phoned me. It was family friends that said, we think you should come over. I mean, it would never occur to my mother to say, we're having a family drama, we need help. My parents just keep going on, sort of battling on regardless, helpless. But I knew that since my father apparently they were sitting at supper and he didn't want to say anything because he didn't want to ruin my mother's time on the Danube and showing off her fabulous legs and the swimming spas that they have. But
she was very proud of them.
Very proud of her fabulous legs. But he began to get pneumonia, and it sort of settled into all his organs. And he said to my mother, watch out, the waiter's a spy, at supper. And then he collapsed, and she called an ambulance, and they said, he's going to die. And I think the thing that's so shocking about our family is we take shocks really well. It's the sort of little stuff that's a bit harder for us to negotiate. We don't do non-drama. We just don't bother. I just can't even remember that happening. And so in a weird way, I trained my whole life for my father to die in a crumbling communist era hospital in Budapest while on vacation with my mother, because somebody had told them that it was the poor man's Paris, and he's always loved Paris. So off they went. And I mean, my father died the way he lived. I think he could see it was the end. I certainly could. We all appalled the doctors and the nurses by sort of being quite pragmatic about that. Even my father, And as someone said and knew him very well, your father always lengthened his stride when other more prudent people would shorten it. And that's what really struck me, was the labor of death, that it's no small thing to cross from this side to next, that there's a real effort and a real courage and determination, I think, that comes with knowing, this I need to let go of. The ultimate thing to let go of, obviously, is your own life. I mean, it can feel like an easy thing or even a wanted thing to do when you're going through terrible grief, the loss of a partner or a child. But truly, I think to watch a strong man throw off his life was a profound lesson, and that he did it with such gratitude and so much. I mean, he never would have used the word love, but there was love there, for sure, for the life that he had had and for what he had done. There wasn't, regret or remorse. It was a really kind of beautiful thing. And it was they say in England, did he have a good death? And I would say, yes, he did. But getting my mother back with these ashes to Zambia was a bit tricky. Just because my mother refused to stay very sober, and it's always alarming to walk around with a box that says human remains this way up.
Which you had on your lap when you were going back. And when you got there, first off, do you have a copy of the book with you?
Yes, I do. I've got the English version. So
good. Could you just show the cover to people who haven't seen it? Now, this, I couldn't believe it when you told me this. That's actually your parents. I thought they've got to be out of central casting. But can you describe your parents for us?
They were out of central casting. I mean, they are very glamorous and very, I'm 51 now. And so their young life seems not just from another time, but from, I mean, truly another era, an era that I can't touch and that shouldn't be touched. And that as, we call the heed to sort of change our narrative and break a narrative, looking at the narrative of who they were was really the end of this really, the false glamour of the British Empire, by which I mean, there was all the violence, the foundational violence, and the attendant trauma of that. But at the time of my parents living, they really sort of, I think, lived the out of Africa kind of exotic dream of it. And so in a way we clashed, our two generations clashed so profoundly, because they were the ones who still sort of went to Rhodesia to keep one country white run. And my sister and I were raised sort of after that independence, through the war, as children through the war. And so that makes a big difference. Again, trauma with no context will give you sort of post-traumatic stress. And so being a child of war is very different than being an adult in war, where you can add context to it. And so it made that my parents had a very romantic view of their lives, and I think I had a quite less romantic view.
And I think maybe part of that was that your parents were two halves of a whole. Could you maybe just describe how they would interact together?
They made a little they were their own culture, wherever they went. And one of the ways that I sort of describe that in short in the book is that my mother sets up this hotel room that we're now stationed and waiting for my father to die, as if we're going to move in. So she's hung the laundry up on the very nice balcony. It was a nice hotel. We completely ruined it. They finally got so desperate they gave me a bedroom just to stop me traipsing up and down the corridor looking so bereft. And then my mother had her drinks tray and her tea tray, and then her little collection of exciting things that she picked up on the streets in Budapest, sticks and bones and fragments of this and that. She's like a magpie. And wanting to, by the way, on top of getting my father's ashes, needing to get all my mother's special things that she had found stuffed into her suitcase, which I managed to throw it all away. But by the time I came back the next morning, she had stuffed a suitcase full of it all again. So they really had this sort of, they were like a small country of two, and they are the government and they are the cultural sort of secretary and they're the language bosses, and you either fit in with that or you don't. I mean, and they're a tremendous force. They're an incredible performance act, and in a way it's as if part of their relationship was this idea that they were going to amuse each other. And that's an enormous contract to make with your partner. I will be funny to the end.
Right. There are so many conversations, but I wonder, you might be able to pick one out of the book where your parents are talking to each other and kind of completing each other's thoughts. And they seem like no matter how outlandish the idea of where they were going to be going, it's the other one was right with them. I mean, and I wonder if you can give us an example of that, because you, and also I should say, just in terms of your writing, we hear in this book very little of you. You're narrating, but we don't hear, regardless of how crazy something somebody said to you is, we don't hear you rolling your eyes or any kind of outrage on your part. All we hear is like the great kind of admiration and amazement of their language and their relationship. Can you find a good example of that?
The example I want to give actually didn't happen, but I love that. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it in such short notice, but there's this passage where Dad, I imagine driving Dad so that he can see the continent one last time that he spent 50 years on. And so I write about...
This is the continent of Africa.
Right. And I write about what it would have been like, because I can even imagine their, I can even imagine their exchange. And I suppose the other one, since this is what I've landed on, is the way that my parents, for example, were at a dinner party. So this is real.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone care to join me for intercourse? Dad would ask, pushing himself back from the table after the soup, before the meat. Or after the meat, but before the pudding, he'd shout, garçon, as if all waiters, even waiters in Zambia, were French, regardless of the more likely scenario, which was that they weren't. Rectify this drought. We're all going outside for a breath of fresh air. Then we drifted outside, following Dad, our glasses refreshed, fresh cigarettes lit, and the air in the car parks or gardens or streets felt suddenly invigorating, our perspectives renewed, everything a little more romantic. Insects calling, frogs, always something scuttling off into the undergrowth in that part of the world. Small mammals up trees or a gecko laughing from the walls beneath electric lights. Let's have a party, that was Dad's war cry. Mum would stiffen slightly. Someone's restless tonight, she'd observe, but the corners of her mouth would be twitching with happy anticipation. Ole! Dad would shout from across the lawn. Ole! Mum would cry, head thrown back. Then after a while, someone sensible would notice the mosquitoes were out in force and that we were all being chewed to death. We'd all clatter inside, another round of drinks. Join us, have a drink, my father would shout to patrons at other tables. Bring your women! That was a dinner party with my father. A wonderful host and a siren call to a crashing hangover. Or, the way my father called it, a proper religious experience.
And that one did happen.
Yeah, lots of times. A version of that. And I think that's the one thing that the older I get, the more I realize that the unkind thing that you do with memoir is you freeze people in time with your experience of them. And that is a brutal thing to do. I feel that myself when somebody freezes me in time. Oh, back then you were. And it doesn't account for the fact that life grows you. I mean, the world will teach whether or not you want to be a student. And so some of us learn faster than others, and some of us appear to not learn much at all. But in my parents' case, I think very difficult to be stuck in, just as it is as a child to be stuck in your parents' sort of view of you as this pointless 10-year-old or whatever they considered. For me to see them, or for my lit to be stuck, I think, so much in the absurd and in my childhood. But in a way, it's I think this is hard for them to probably hear, but it's my love letter to them, this continual love letter, because I can't get enough. I mean, every time I sit down to write something else, they're the people who bubble up to the surface. I think that may have ended by now, finally. I might actually write a memoir about myself.
About what?
Myself. With
about
me
yourself. Great. Just a little bit more on your mom and your parents. I mean, you mentioned that you grew up against the backdrop, really after independence. In Rhodesia, your parents were tied to the old ways, and they were not interested in seeing new ways of life, new government come along. How do you feel like they were, when you look at them in terms of a snapshot of where they were, that they evolved eventually from that, or was that lifelong?
No, and I think that was in a way, the wonderful lesson of losing the war is that is a loss, that is a grief. If you're you were on the white side of that, on the sort of Ian Smith Rhodesian government side of that civil war, it was something that you lost. And I think that is something that is has not been honestly written and talked about. That there was this real way in which, for white identity, that got exploded, and there were really two ways that you could handle it. You pick up the shards and fragments and sort of broken bits of what you were and kind of, bleed with them, for heaven's sake, but go on, and in a way that was my mother. But my father did a very different thing. He dropped those shards. He did this thing that I talk about in grief. He unburdened himself of, the prejudice and arrogance and I think anger that you need to go into that kind of war. I'm not saying it happened overnight, but I do think it was as a result of honestly grieving both the war and also his personal life. And this is what I come back to over and over and over again, that an ungrieved population, a population who doesn't grieve its wars, doesn't grieve its wrongs, doesn't grieve its losses, is destined to stay in, anger and pain. Some combination of that might not look like it. You may sort of carry on and be battle hardened, but that fragility, that those people because they're one touchstone away from road rage that you can't believe. I mean, that kind of barely bottled anger. I know it myself in grieving my son. I see it in the community around me, and I certainly saw it at the end of the war. There's the remnant anger and the way that it really wasn't dealt with. It just wasn't dealt with. We didn't have a proper, okay, that was a nasty, nasty, long, brutal fight. We may not agree. I mean, I think this is the thing, is that in Zimbabwe and now in this country, we're up to a similar thing. We may not agree with each other, but I think there's this way in which we have to come on into a demilitarized zone and at least see each other in disagreement in that space with our munitions down. The interesting thing is I think it's almost impossible within families. We're asking ourselves to do this thing that we haven't even done personally yet. We haven't made those little reconciliations with our own family about our sort of thoughts and feelings around race and racial violence, and especially something as big and dramatic as the Rhodesian Civil War, which is sort of poster child of racial violence. If you leave all secrets of what make you sick, and they separate, but it can be very, very annoying to have a member of your family, such as me, constantly bringing it up in book after book after book, and so I think. Part of, and I think unanswered. I'm the one with the voice, with the story, with the narrative, and yet the people about whom I'm writing there's no you-moi in this, it's a me-moi. So it's my point of view. I might not be in it. And I think that I don't know I guess that's a hanging question. Do both sides need to be weighed up and told? I think, unfortunately, that the voice always goes to the person who's willing to sit down and put it out there.
Did your mother hate the fact that you married an American and moved to the U.S.?
I mean, I think given the book that I then wrote, it helped her explain away that this is how it happened. Because there's people on here from Zimbabwe and Tanzania and so on. And so they will attest, you bring up an American, there's just a sort of, there's a universal eye roll, just happens. And so it so happened that I married
Americans and their white teeth.
And their fabulous white teeth, right. And straight teeth too. And I married an American, so that was already bad enough, although my parents were very fond of my ex-husband, and my sister, much more fond of him than of me, by the way. And and he was a way better son for them in some ways. He was a river guide, and he was very tough and didn't complain. He certainly wasn't going to sit down and write some navel-gazing memoir, that's for sure. But then I moved to the States, and I missed them so much, and particularly Zimbabwe just was a physical ache, and anyone raised on that land knows what I'm talking about. I mean, it hurts you to be torn from it. And so I wrote Don't Let's Go the Dogs Night really as a love story to my parents, but my mother, which was my first memoir, my mother just thought this is just to make me sound like a raging, racist alcoholic, to which is very, I did. But her sort of follow-on was, just because you're an American now. Americans, they like to write books about how they haven't been hugged enough as children so that they can get on the Oprah Springer show.
Oprah Springer Show, the combination.
Yeah.
Yeah, your mother, we should say, she was very fond of animals, and she was extremely fond of all the animals around her, cats, dogs, everything. More so, I think, than kids, grandchildren or great grandchildren, who she kind of held at a bit of a distance. And but there was a very strong affection there. And how is your mom right now, by the way?
I mean, quite well, I think. I don't communicate with her very regularly. I mean, the estrangement from my family was real.
Yeah.
And very, very painful. I mean, so extraordinarily painful. And I think that is not sort of spoken about enough, that the decision to divorce someone you really love, sometimes a decision you have to make, because it's just not, I mean, it was a love that wasn't, harmless. It was a harmful love. I mean, both ways, I think. And so now we have a relationship more like what she had with her mother. She was very, very close to her mother. They wrote to each other the most beautiful, beautiful letters about the dogs and the weather and interesting and entertaining things neighbors might have gotten up to, and other comments about obituaries and notable deaths that may have happened in the area. Someone getting squashed by an elephant, that would make it into the letter. Usually page 3, you keep real dramas for later on. And that is the sort of relationship that I think my mother really, it was unfair on her in a way to have someone, I can see this now, but it's taken me a lifetime. I was the kid who never stopped asking why war, why racism, why this, why anything, why the moon, why every single thing. And it's great if you're going to go out and be an investigative reporter, but it's terrible if you're someone's child, especially if you're in the family culture of we don't air our dirty linen, and we don't sort of, my mother would always say, not another autopsy, baby. I cannot bear autopsy. Do we have to keep digging up these dead bodies and talking about everything? But for me, it is, it's been impossible to go forward into the unknown without first knowing more deeply who I was. And I don't know why you have to do, I don't know why you can't just jump from, from the innocence of a child's perspective. You literally are just very accepting. You're in constant stage of acceptance of everything that happens, however brutal. That experience then breaks you or traumatizes you or shapes you in some way. And I think there's this way in which much of my life was sort of bursting off fragments of that and then coming to this place of unknowing in which I can accept that I don't have the relationship with my mother that I expected to have. I have this different relationship. And I think she's doing well in and of herself.
And you have a sister who is still in Africa.
In Zambia.
Your book begins with the death of your dad, your reaction to it, your mom's reaction to it, and the book ends with the death of your son in the States. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about that, because it comes to the reader extremely suddenly, because it came to you extremely suddenly.
Yeah, he, I think that, can I read that chapter? Because I wrote it probably better than I can say it, if I can find it. Yeah.
And I should say, while you're finding that, maybe, Lisette, in a few minutes, we can go to some questions from the audience.
All right. So this is the way it went quickly. I lost Dad, and in the next 2 years and 3 months, everything I had assumed I'd love forever seemed to tumble after him. I should have known better. Nothing is forever except forever. Dad had comforted me with this terror my whole life. If possible, baby, try to preserve a bit of energy for the end, he had said at the very end. You never know when you'll need it. Maybe he had seen my end, or maybe all ends are the same. Vanessa went first after Dad. I mean, she removed herself from my orbit impressively. It takes some doing to break the bonds of a sisterhood like ours. Trauma bonds, I mean. Nothing gentle happened in the making of us as sisters. It wasn't a gentle uncoupling. Hug and make up, a family friend had urged, as if I could walk through walls and over minefields, as if I had special powers, or as if Vanessa had a magic wand. And then skipping forward, I'd been delirious with love with my fiance, and then we had broken up. And then we get to the part where I had loved him so much. I believed him to be the cure for my soul. And because of this, he was. We slept together under a yurt. We lived in a yurt together, under a yurt's plexiglass dome, the sky skidding toward dawn above our heads, the dog sleeping at our feet, my youngest child asleep in a loft above our heads. In my grief, I'd never been so happy. But grief puts you to sleep for 100 years, or pain blunts your awareness. Something happens when you lose too much too fast. You stop tracking. Dad died and I couldn't write like I had. The old thoughts wouldn't come. My words were bitter and angry and God-forsaken. Then when and I ended. That spring was the saddest of my life. And then how I longed for when, all the way into the start of the hot summer, Aries rising red and early in the east. I wept and wept each moon. Then my son Fuller had a seizure in Argentina. He had awoken to find himself in the ICU. Charlie, my ex-husband, and I bought air tickets the day of the incident. It was decided I would stay with our youngest and see her through the beginning of her summer holidays. He'd fly down. Fuller came with him. He had been funny and brave. Fuller waking up in the emergency room in a strange country with no one speaking his language. I'm literally naked and afraid, he had joked to me on the phone. Oh, perspective. Just come home in one piece, I begged. He did. He'd been checked out at our local hospital, deemed fine. A week later, he died in his sleep. I knew he died the moment I saw the text from Charlie flash up on my phone. Call me. I knew then what happened, because all parents carry that fear somewhere in their cells. My body knew before my ears would hear the words, our son had died.
Thank you for reading that. You went to your son's bedside and stayed with him for hours until they took his body away. And I was thinking, at the beginning of the book, after your dad dies and you come back to your parents' home in Africa, this kind of creaky home with lots of cracks where snakes could get through and all, and you went to your dad's bed to sleep in his bed that night. And I'm just looking at my notes here. You said, you wrote, it was more than I could stand, a lifetime I'd burrowed into the smell. And now it would be fading, every minute fading. I couldn't breathe him in fast enough. What was the similarity and the difference between your dad's death and how you mourned that immediately, and your son's death and how you mourned that?
Such a good question, Lisa, because when I lost my father, it definitely felt like my past had died with him. And it took a while for that past to die. It takes a minute, it sort of sloughs off. The thing dies immediately, but then it was the smell of him. It was the ideas of myself. It was the idea of who I was when I was his daughter. When my son died, the future disappeared. It just washed away. There was nowhere for me to step. And when my father died, I no longer knew who I was. When my son died, I no longer knew who to be. And the only way that I could survive it, I mean, you can be in that terror and horror, and you will be, and the screaming is intense. I mean, it is the most horrific, your body is taken over by a grief that enormous. But eventually I found the only way to survive was to be in the perpetual now. And there was so much about being raised where I was that gave me comfort, and early on in my loss of my son, a friend reached out to me from Zimbabwe, and instead of saying what so many American people had said to me, which was, you'll never get over this, she said, "We are grieving with you. The first one is the hardest." And that just slapped everything into perspective that, for so many, the world's majority, losing a child is normal, and to lose more than one child is normal. And in fact, my parents lost 3 children. And so it gave me, I think, a global perspective that I could no longer ignore and deny, that any violence that sort of culminates in the death of children, I could no longer separate myself, I guess, from the photographs of migrant fathers holding their children, just because I know what it is to want to stop the world and bring that body back. But I can't know. And I had that in relative comfort, relative privilege, relative extreme protection.
And you have daughters as well now.
Yes.
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 Lisa, if you're there, if there are questions that that we can ask.
Hi, everyone. That was really so moving. Thank you. We don't have any questions yet, but we still have time for folks to write down their questions. That was so moving that I can imagine that everyone was just focused on the reading and the conversation.
Lisa, I've got a question. Go ahead.
Yeah.
There was a passage that you and I talked about yesterday that I thought you had written. I got so confused, but it was about sunset in Zambia. Do you know where that was in the book?
It was in chapter 1, and I don't have the book with me right now,
Okay.
unfortunately, but it was
I'm
chapter
gonna see
1.
if I can find it.
And so I'll explain to the audience what we're, Lisa, thank you. If there are any questions that come in, then please feel free.
Do you miss Africa? I can see the question.
I can start interrupting you as soon as the question starts coming in, and I see a few. So go ahead, and then I'll break in.
So I'll just introduce this passage that I hope, Alexandra, you're able to find. It struck me when I was listening to this. I work in radio, you work in print, in books, and we're told not to overload stories with adjectives. And it doesn't always work when you think it will. And as I was reading the book and listening to it, I thought, you're presenting the most descriptive images of, in this case, the Southern African sky. And I barely remember an adjective in there. And I think that's a sign of a really good writer, because it was so evocative without saying it was stunning.
Right.
So if you can find that, I wonder how you do that. And if it takes effort to find, as you mentioned, the noun juste, the right noun instead of the best adjective.
I actually can't find the exact fabulous passage that you're talking about.
I think it was when your father was taking you. He was hunting a zebra.
Oh.
And so you were heading out.
Okay, chapter 2. Got it. Yes.
Oh, chapter 2. Yeah.
And I do think, there is this, I think, a really, when you're writing about something that's been overwritten, been appropriated, become a trope, like the African sunset, and I think has become, so out of Africa, you have to remove yourself and give it the respect of the thing that it is. And so for me, then finding the correct noun gives the place back to itself. And it isn't me adding, and it doesn't need anything added to it. Just to say what it is enough. When it's that beautiful line from Bertolt Brecht, when you say the truth, everyone's heart must be torn to shreds. And that sometimes when for me, I seem to have had a life that's been at volume 15. And so, my father dying in a crumbling communist era hospital, and the sort of drama that the Fullers seem to bring with it as our weather system, to pull back and write with a light touch. The only way this isn't going to feel like an assault, I think, and to allow the reader to have their own feelings, so you're not imposing your own emotion onto it. Yeah.
Right.
So I will interrupt because we have a few questions. I'm going to read them out. And the first one is pretty simple. Do you miss Africa?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm reading Myth because I think what else is there to do at this stage of our existence but to go back to the beginning and see where we went so horribly wrong. But this idea of Pandora, all gifts, she had everything, and it all flew out of the box except hope. Africa is Pandora. It has all gifts. And sometimes, somehow, I think that, the kind of, the trauma of a colonial setup and the trauma of hundreds of years, centuries of slavery, the trauma of colonization, the traumas of war, I think have meant that so much of those gifts aren't apparent, but what we're left with is hope. And I think there's a reason why if you've never gone anywhere on the continent, you get to Tanzania, you say, I'm home. There is a reason for that. I think I know what the reason is, but yeah, I miss it. I miss, there's nothing I don't miss about it. I mean, culturally, right? Just as taking culture, when somebody dies, there's a ritual where I come from, and in a lot of parts of Africa, but Southern Africa, I know for sure. It's called Mzi, and the participants, upon hearing of your grief, will ululate, like a child has died in the village. And there is nothing like an ululation. For me, that sounds like a prayer straight from women to God. And there is something about women crying in unison for God's attention that just, your heart will be torn to shreds. It's a truth. But then people roll on the ground in agony. They roll with you, and it's an attempt to show you, look, you can't break this bond with the living yourself. We're going to help you do it. And for me, missing Africa is as much about missing the community of people who are so attached to ancestor and earth, not just stuck in material world now, but so dimensional. That I miss with a terrible ache.
There's a follow-up question from one of our guests, which is very related to what you were just saying. But what is your connection with Zambia, Zimbabwe today? The person who's asking is someone who has lived in both countries and friends who have left. And many years later, they still feel out of place outside of Africa.
Well, I mean, I think Lisa and I talked about this last year. It's the sort of, there is so much thinking that went behind this and so much feeling, but for me, it became about climate change, the violence of a estranged family, climate change, and the fact that I wasn't sure that going back and back and back to Zimbabwe and Zambia, I just didn't feel like a place that I should be going anymore. And it was very difficult for me to come to terms with that. Very difficult. I wanted to be in denial. But the one thing I couldn't deny was that I felt that my incessantly flying out there was just throwing more inflammation on an already inflamed situation, whether it was, personal with my family or climate change or the fact that, we're in a moment where Zimbabwe and Zambia could probably use less sort of fewer people like me running around for 7 minutes and then coming back and writing about it over and over and over again. And that it, my sort of, my absolute anchoring was when my son died, and where his ashes are or where I belong. My inconsolable shadow is there, always with him. And to go back there is just to tear myself even more. And so in a strange way, actually this month I wrote a piece in Oprah magazine about how I wasn't going to fly again, and I won't be going home again. It'll be like boarding school. I'll write letters to my mum and my sister and about the dogs and the weather, and probably we'll have a really good relationship that way. But it was a brutal thing. I wept and wept. I really grieved. That, why there was ever a possibility that it was so easy we should fly back and forth. I've even said myself it shouldn't be so possible. But weirdly, sort of, as we all went through the pandemic this spring, and which I did in the yurt for the most part, and skied out my back door, and then watched spring come, I felt for the first time deeply at home. And it was ironic to me that in order to stop feeling perpetually homesick for Zimbabwe and Zambia, I had to root myself in a tent in Idaho. And believe myself to be, that this is where my work is now. So part of my work is to ground, to stop being so frenetic. An unsettled white settler, there's a violence to that.
That's really incredible answer. I have a question actually two questions from two different members of the audience that are related. One is simply, is estrangement with loved ones a risk of writing a memoir? And the other one is, your family's mixed feelings about your work. How do you handle that reaction? And do you feel responsibility for having inflamed that estrangement with your writing?
Yes, both. Yes. And I have this idea. I mean, I do think there's a room for humor, that a memoir is my perspective and it's my point of view on everyone. And however much I think I've been kind and gentle and loving and what have you, of course, that's not how it feels when you read it. You feel very insulted and hurt. And I've had this idea of a podcast or something or something I say because I'm so technologically crippled, but where I am exposed for who I really am, not on the page. So the worst email I've ever written to everyone in my family, not the sort of careful, thoughtful memoirs where I package myself or I step out of the picture altogether, but really what could happen to me if I had to face myself? What would that look like? And I think that would be, in a way, a taste of my own medicine that might do me good. I mean, even thinking about it absolutely terrifies me. But I think that there is something about, this way in which part of our culture has been to really hide ourselves. And I think that we have confused what's personal and what's private. And we've made what's private the things that we are ashamed of. And we've, instead of saying, no, sometimes those things are personal. It's personal to have these beliefs that maybe get sort of, that harden into prejudice. It's personal to have messy relationships. And yet if we don't show those in public, if there isn't a way for us to discuss or talk about that, then isn't it a shock and surprise to our children when they grow up and find themselves exchanging toxic emails with someone they love? And how do you manage that? And where is the DMZ? Where do you finally say, I am not my opinion about you? You're not my opinion of me, of you. That's all it is. It's an opinion. It doesn't need to hurt or kill either of us. So having done that, having really hurt people, I'm now in middle age going, not that I regret doing it, because I think that secrecy is so dangerous. And also I couldn't have stopped this thing getting written out of me. I just was that I would have had to die. Like that would have been like trying to stop. I mean, people do. You can dam up a river, but God, it's not good for the river.
You needed to tell your truth. And I think we're all the better off for it. There's a number of people who feel exactly the same that are participating in today's event. And one of them wants you to talk a little bit more about how you live in the now.
Well, it's, it took a minute to get to the now. And it took, rolling off the sofa at very early, I think even before I was sober, before my father died, because I remember telling him about this, and going off to a 10-day Vipassana meditation retreat where you meditate. It's so me to not know, never having meditated for a minute, never having really thought about it. Just go online, find any old thing. 10 days of silence, this will do. 2 meals a day, it's free. You just pay whatever you think you want to. Off you go, shut up. You give them your cell phone, your car keys. It's boot camp, it's brutal. But it was so good for me because it was the beginning of my realization that a search for justice isn't the same for your own search for sort of comfort. You shouldn't mistake your comfort and your security, my mother would always say, and my daughter reminds me. And my younger daughter reminds me, don't take your symptoms too seriously. Meditation, I think, is the beginning of helping you do that. And that was probably 7 years ago that I started to meditate. The instruction that would have saved me hours and hours and days of silent meditation would have been renounce unnecessary thought. Just that. And that keeps you right now. And my short trick way, to getting there is to go into my feet, be present in my feet. My feet is the furthest thing from my brain that there is, and my feet are always exactly where I'm standing right now. And so as your heart is flying from your mouth because you're wrapped around, your son's body, or at that memorial service, going into your feet isn't a way of leaving your body. It's a way of staying in your body and staying with the necessary animal emotion of grief. And I live in my yurt. Right opposite me is a dairy farm. And at night, the calves are taken from the cows. And sometimes the cows and I call for our children at the same time. And they're bellowing for their calf, and I'm bellowing for my son. And, it sounds the same. It sounds just the same.
Mm.
Yeah. And that's now too. And that's okay. And to be in a chorus of cattle, how grateful am I? Is there anything more earth-shattering than a cow screaming for her calf?
Yeah. I don't think I've ever participated in an event where it has been so emotional for me as well as for everyone in the audience. Thank you so much for all the time you're giving. I'm gonna just have 2 more questions from the audience. And Lisa, do you have anything you'd like to add? We have a little bit of time before our program shuts us down. But one of the questions, what's next for you personally and in writing projects? And how different is it to live in a yurt in Idaho from growing up as you did in Africa?
I've made it the same. Look, I live in a very posh tent. What was really funny, about a couple of months ago, I was, by the way, let me start by saying, I love my mother. I have scoured the earth to find someone who does to me what she does. It's like the sun comes up everywhere. That isn't really good for you when you're a 51-year-old daughter trying to find your own space. But so let's just go back. I'm sorry, back to the question. We were in Idaho. How is that? I've brought so much of her with me. My kitchen is my mother. I've even got Le Creuset pots, and the fact that I read and love books, I got that from her. The fact that when I lost everything, I went on petfinder.com and I found myself the most absurd looking little dog. He's a magpie cross border collie, I think. And he, during the pandemic, was such an emotional support that he earned the full title of Dr. Baby Jesus Jorge, PhD. Oh. And now, if that is not my mother, I don't know what is. And my constant conversation with the animals and living above my horse, and the fact that I at night switch off the lights and light candles, that I can picture being here with nothing but a radio, as my parents were on the farm with nothing but a radio. That there is something about solitude that drills you down to the depth of yourself in a way that having so much internet time and so much input doesn't allow. And so to get to the end of a life and to lose yourself completely seems to have been a life that has missed a major part of yourself. And I think living in Idaho the way that I did growing up, it's no different. I dig around in the dirt most of the day and ride my horse, take the dogs out for a walk, and sit down and get some books written.
I might have to join you over in Idaho.
I drink a lot less than I used to.
Lisa, do you have any last questions?
Just one question. I know very often people in the audience want to know about writing. And I wonder, just one little piece of advice, maybe for people out there who want to know about the craft and how you do it and what you think they could do.
It's changed for me completely, and I might be so wrong, but some of it has been, I bought this place 6 months after my son died. I scraped together everything I could, and I thought, if I'm not going to die under this, I need to build something. And I knew that sitting down and writing a book had been the hardest thing I ever did. And that was a brutality. To write this book, Travel Light, Move Fast, felt to me the most difficult thing I've ever done. Also, bearing in mind, I didn't do it having to be a refugee, having to actually grieve more children, having to do it in prison, having to do it having lost my son in some violent, different way. But I woke up at 4 a.m, meditated for an hour, set my watch and grieved for an hour. And then I wrote for 4 hours. Then I would get up and do my exercises, get your blood going a bit, write for a few more hours, and then get on a bicycle or a horse or something, anything to get your blood going, change your mind, and off I go. And since I've written this book, though, and since building this place, and the lesson that construction has taught me is that go slow, level everything, and chat to your old dairy farmer neighbor as often as he'll let you. He's 72 years old and he's left his dairy farm one night in 50 years. He's only because he can't stand to leave his cows. I said, what was it for? He said, a funeral, and it wasn't worth it. And I love that we prop up over the fence and we talk about weeding and we talk about weather. And he reminded me again the way my father used to. It's good to be fallow. It's good. It's good for the planet. It's good for us. It's good. We don't all need to consume our way through life. I don't. I'll speak for me. Through my life all that fast, that sometimes laying fallow help you get the weeds out that way. You lie fallow under the sun, the weeds come up, plow them up. And that's in a way what this moment of preparing to write has been, is watching the weeds of my grief come up, watching the entanglements of, somebody asked this beautiful question, the idea of your podcast, of the real memoir, is very interesting. Isn't there still so much potential to have a wall up? Don't you get angry anymore? Never take things personally. Of course I do. I'm furious half the time. I take lots of things personally. And then I get back on my cushion and I do the ego eradicator because it's too painful to walk around with this much anger and this much ego. And so preparing to write this book, it was so hard because and the next book, I'm always writing. I started to write about my mother just reflexively because I can't stop. And then I thought, no, you're done, Miss Fuller. You are done. You have said enough. It's time to write about you. And so for me, I know that the next story I want to write is about this, about surviving the grief of one of the worst griefs you can go through, because I think that as a nation, we have to learn to be unafraid of grief and to know. And there was this way in which you have to do a difficult thing. But we don't have support structures, and we don't have, I don't think, clues about how to do grief or even how to look at it, how to be unafraid of the anger and the depression, the denial that comes up with grief. And to notice that when we see collective denial, when we see collective anger, that's stuck grief. That nationally we got a lot of that going on, and that we can't resolve nationally what we don't resolve personally. And so, yes, I think the idea of a podcast is so critical because I'm not a Buddha. I'm not some guru. I'm not Pema Chodron, and I'm not, I'm an ordinary feeling human with masses of imperfections and an enormous capacity to love, who has screwed up monumentally, who has profoundly hurt people, who has profoundly loved people, who has profoundly been hurt and been loved. And it's to deconstruct that in a way so that the mystery comes out of it, and that the storytelling does some of the work of holding the heart. And so for me now, writing is about waiting until what I have to say can't not be said. And the only way that I can know that is if I also observe a lot of silence. And so beginning in February, for 2 weeks at a time, I don't have my beautiful daughter, my 14-year-old. She's with her dad, my ex. And so for 2 weeks, I try and, to the degree that it's completely possible, which really isn't living out here, I maintain complete silence. And it's a fabulous medicine. And it allows me to hear what needs to be written. And for me, I wish someone had told me that a lot earlier. It's the process, it's not the production. And the process, that stillness, that can be enough to put you off right there. Just observing your own thoughts.
Alexandra Fuller, thank you so much. And Lisa, thank you so much.
Thank you
It's been
both.
a pleasure. And for everyone in the audience, thank you for your questions. I'm sure there are some we didn't get to answer, but I was really wonderful. Thank you.
Yes.
Lisa, thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you both. This has been an incredible experience. And I just want to let everyone in the audience know that if you want to watch this all over again, you can. As soon as we end, the recording will be available. I'm going to listen to it again because it was just so full of just so much beauty. And I'm just so incredibly grateful that I had a chance to be a part of it. Thank you. And thank you again. And Lisa, thank you so much for your graciousness with our little technical difficulty. Again, folks, the book is available right through this little link under Miss Fuller's body, essentially. And we can, Books and Books is our community bookstore, can send that anywhere in the world very quickly. Thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful night under the stars for you. And we're all going to go outside now and watch our stars also. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.